One of the greatest misunderstandings about empaths is that people believe their patience is endless. Because empaths are calm, understanding, and forgiving, many assume they will tolerate anything. But what most people fail to realize is that an empath's patience is not weakness. It is emotional strength combined with deep compassion. And like all forms of strength, it has limits, especially when emotional disrespect becomes a pattern. Emotional disrespect is not always loud or obvious. It rarely begins with major conflict. Instead, it often appears in small, repeated moments. It happens when someone dismisses an empath's feelings during serious conversations. It appears when their sensitivity is mocked or labeled as overreaction. It grows when their emotional needs are ignored, while they continue to support others without recognition. Empaths experience emotions with intense depth. They naturally notice emotional tone, body language, and subtle changes in energy that most people overlook. Because of this heightened awareness, they are highly sensitive to emotional imbalance in relationships. When their feelings are repeatedly dismissed, they do not simply forget or move on. They internalize the experience, trying to understand why their emotional presence is not valued. At first, an empath responds to emotional disrespect with patience. They try to communicate calmly. They explain their feelings carefully, hoping to build emotional understanding. They give second chances because they genuinely believe relationships can grow stronger through honest communication. But when emotional disrespect continues, something begins to change inside them. They start feeling emotionally unsafe. Conversations begin to feel exhausting rather than comforting. They begin noticing that their kindness is expected but rarely appreciated. The relationship slowly transforms from emotional connection into emotional responsibility, where the empath carries the emotional weight alone. This shift creates silent emotional pain. Empaths rarely create dramatic confrontations when they are hurt. Instead, they observe quietly. They analyze behavior patterns. They begin emotionally withdrawing while still appearing present. To others, nothing seems different. The empath still listens, still supports, still remains calm. But internally, their emotional attachment is slowly weakening. What makes repeated emotional disrespect so damaging is that it destroys trust gradually. Trust for an empath is not built only on loyalty. It is built on emotional safety, the feeling that their vulnerability is respected and protected. When that safety disappears, the empath begins preparing themselves for emotional distance. By the time an empath finally walks away, their decision is rarely impulsive. It is the result of accumulated emotional neglect. They have already fought countless internal battles, questioning whether they asked for too much or expected too much understanding. They have already tried to repair the connection silently. When they leave, it often shocks people. The empath never screamed, threatened, or demanded attention. But emotional exhaustion does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it ends quietly, through distance, silence, and eventually absence. The most important truth to understand is this: empaths do not leave because they stop caring. They leave because they finally realized their emotional presence was not respected. And once an empath feels emotionally unseen or unvalued for too long, rebuilding that trust becomes almost impossible. Because for an empath, emotional respect is not a luxury. It is the foundation of every connection they choose to keep in their life. Empaths are naturally built on emotional honesty. They communicate with sincerity, express their feelings openly, and value emotional transparency in relationships. Because they live through emotional truth, they expect others to interact with the same authenticity. But when an empath encounters manipulation or emotional games, the damage goes far deeper than ordinary conflict. It strikes at the very foundation of their ability to trust. Manipulation is not always obvious. It rarely appears as open control or direct dishonesty. Instead, it often hides behind subtle emotional tactics. It can show itself through guilt tripping, where someone makes the empath feel responsible for their emotions. It can appear through gaslighting, where the empath's reality is questioned or dismissed. It can also exist in silent treatment, emotional withdrawal, or inconsistent affection that creates confusion and insecurity. Empaths possess strong emotional intuition. They can sense emotional inconsistency even when words appear kind. They notice when behavior does not match emotional intention. At first, an empath may ignore these signs because they tend to believe in the goodness of the relationship. They may convince themselves that the other person is struggling emotionally or acting out of temporary stress, but emotional games create a dangerous pattern for an empath. Because empaths are deeply compassionate, they often give multiple chances to someone who is manipulating them. They try to communicate calmly. They attempt to repair misunderstandings. They offer emotional support even when they are confused or hurt. However, every repeated moment of emotional manipulation slowly weakens their trust. Trust for an empath is sacred. It is not given easily, but once it is given, it is deeply rooted. When someone manipulates an empath's emotions, it creates a sense of emotional betrayal. The empath begins to feel unsafe sharing their vulnerability. They start questioning whether their honesty is being used against them. Instead of reacting with anger, empaths often respond with silence and observation. They become emotionally alert. They start analyzing patterns instead of words. They begin protecting their emotions by sharing less of themselves. Their conversations become shorter. Their emotional openness slowly disappears. To others, this change may seem confusing. The empath still appears calm and respectful. They do not create arguments or confrontations, but internally they are emotionally detaching. They are preparing themselves to survive without the connection that once felt meaningful. The most painful reality about manipulation is that it changes how an empath views the entire relationship. Conflict can be forgiven, mistakes can be understood, but emotional deception breaks the sense of safety that empaths need to maintain emotional closeness. Once they feel that their emotions are being controlled or used, their ability to trust rarely returns to its original depth. By the time an empath decides to erase someone from their life, their decision has already been made internally. They have already accepted that emotional honesty cannot exist where manipulation is present. Their departure is not dramatic, it is quiet, final, and emotionally resolved. Empaths do not disappear to punish others. They disappear because they understand that emotional games slowly destroy their mental and emotional well-being. They choose distance not out of revenge, but out of self-protection. Because for an empath, trust is not just part of a relationship, it is the emotional ground that allows love, connection, and vulnerability to grow. And once that ground is broken by manipulation, rebuilding it becomes almost impossible. There's a silent pain that rarely gets spoken about in relationships with empaths. It is not betrayal, not loud conflict, and not dramatic endings. It is something far quieter and far more damaging. It is the feeling of constantly giving while receiving almost nothing in return. For an empath, one-sided effort is not just exhausting, it slowly erases their sense of emotional presence. Empaths naturally invest deeply in the people they care about. They listen when others are overwhelmed. They remember small details about someone's struggles, dreams, and fears. They show up emotionally even when they themselves are tired. To an empath, connection is not transactional, it is instinctive. They give because they feel deeply, not because they expect rewards. But when that emotional effort becomes one-sided, something begins to shift inside them. At first, the empath does not complain. They often assume the other person is simply going through a difficult phase. They become more understanding, more patient, and sometimes even give more effort to compensate for the imbalance. They reply faster, check in more often, and try harder to maintain the connection. They believe that love and loyalty can repair distance. However, over time, a painful realization begins to grow. The empath starts noticing that their support is expected but rarely returned. Their messages are long and thoughtful, while the responses they receive are short and distracted. They remember birthdays, emotional struggles, and important milestones, but their own moments go unnoticed. Slowly, they begin to feel like they are emotionally present in a relationship where the other person is only partially there. This is where invisibility begins. Feeling invisible does not mean the empath is ignored completely. It means their emotional depth is overlooked. Their sacrifices are seen as normal. Their constant support becomes something others rely on without appreciating. And for an empath, being emotionally unseen hurts more than being physically alone. Empaths are not asking for perfection. They do not expect equal energy every single day. What they need is emotional acknowledgement. They need to feel that their presence matters, that their voice is heard, and that their effort is valued. When that validation is missing for too long, their emotional strength starts turning into emotional withdrawal. Interestingly, when an empath reaches this stage, they rarely explode or create dramatic confrontations. Instead, they begin to reduce their effort quietly. They stop initiating conversations as often. They stop sharing their inner world. They observe rather than participate. This is not manipulation or punishment. It is emotional self-protection. Eventually, if the imbalance continues, the empath may walk away completely. Not because they stop caring, but because they finally realize that caring alone cannot sustain a relationship. They understand that love should feel mutual, not draining. They understand that emotional connection requires two people choosing each other consistently. And when an empath leaves due to one-sided effort, it often surprises the other person. From the outside, it looks sudden, but internally, the empath has been slowly fading for a long time. The lesson here is simple yet powerful. Empaths do not disappear because they are weak. They disappear because they finally recognize their emotional worth. They realize that being valued is not too much to ask for. It is the foundation of every meaningful connection. Empaths are among the most emotionally loyal people you will ever encounter. When they connect with someone, they do not do it casually or temporarily. Their connections are built on sincerity, trust, and emotional depth. When an empath chooses to care about someone, they invest their time, energy, and emotional presence fully. They protect the relationship even during difficult moments, because loyalty is not just a choice for them, it is part of who they are. But emotional loyalty has one powerful weakness. When it is betrayed, the damage runs deeper than ordinary heartbreak. It creates a fracture in the very foundation of trust that the empath carefully built over time. Betrayal does not always come in obvious or dramatic forms, like cheating or open dishonesty. Sometimes betrayal appears in quieter, more subtle ways. It can happen when someone shares an empath's private emotions with others. It can happen when the empath stands beside someone during their vulnerable moments, only to be abandoned when they themselves need support. It can happen when promises are repeatedly broken, or when emotional commitment is replaced by convenience. Empaths take emotional loyalty very seriously because they know how vulnerable it is to trust someone with their true feelings. They do not easily open their inner world to others. When they do, it means they believe the relationship is safe enough to hold their authenticity. So when that emotional safety is violated, it does not simply cause pain. It creates emotional clarity. At first, an empath may try to understand the betrayal. They may question whether it was intentional or caused by misunderstanding. They often search for reasons to forgive because their nature pushes them toward healing rather than separation. They replay conversations, memories, and emotional moments, hoping to find reassurance that the connection can still be saved. But when betrayal becomes undeniable, something inside the empath changes permanently. Instead of reacting with explosive anger, they often become deeply quiet. Their silence is not weakness. It is the moment they begin emotionally processing the loss of trust. They stop sharing their feelings openly. They begin protecting their vulnerability. And while they may still appear present in the relationship, their emotional bond is already weakening. The most significant truth about betrayal for an empath is that it destroys their sense of emotional security. Once they believe that their loyalty was not respected, their ability to feel safe around that person disappears. Without emotional safety, the connection no longer feels genuine. It begins to feel like a risk to their emotional well-being. When an empath finally reaches their breaking point, their decision is rarely impulsive. It is the result of deep reflection and internal struggle. They have already forgiven multiple times. They have already tried to rebuild trust silently. By the time they decide to walk away, they have already accepted the emotional ending internally. This is why when an empath leaves after betrayal, they rarely return to the same relationship. Not because they lack forgiveness, but because they have learned how damaging it can be to remain loyal to someone who could not protect their trust. For an empath, loyalty is sacred. And when that loyalty is broken, walking away becomes more than a choice. It becomes a necessary step toward emotional survival and self-respect.